Hey everyone, welcome to another Modern Deck Tech. Today we are deck teching Vadrok Domain Zoo. Oh man, I had so much fun with this deck. Really, it was a nice change of pace from my usual Teamer or Tempo decks. This was a 5-color deck, or is a 5-color deck. There's Domain Zoo lists running around there. When Sign of Draco was first spoiled, I was like, oh, alright, there we go. Domain is going to come back, and oh man, this deck is brutal. It's just brutal. I don't know how many times I'm going to say in this deck tech. Really, really fun to play. Let's get right into the core. But before I do, quick plug, of course, as usual. If you want to support me on Patreon, check out the link in the description of this video. Check out that 5-minute video on my Patreon page that explains the Patreon rewards program. You won't regret it. It's really, really cool. My 38 plus patrons can testify to that. But yeah, check it out. Would appreciate your support on there. Okay, the core. So I'm going to admit here, Vadrok, Apex of Thunder is not technically required to play this deck. So you could, in theory, swap out 3 of them for anything else you want to have in this deck. But I found it to be a pretty useful tool to have. I mean, worst case, it's just a 3/3 flying first strike creature. But realistically, you want to be able to mutate it onto another card, obviously going under the creature, giving it flying first strike, and its ability when it mutates is brutal, considering you're also playing Tribal Flames, which we'll get to in a second. So whenever this creature mutates, you may cast target non-creature card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. This is just, by the way, it doesn't get exiled, so it goes back in the graveyard. So yeah, you want to free Tribal Flames? Well, not free, but you may cast it. Yeah, why not? Just do it. Yeah, and it is free actually. It says without paying its mana cost. Just do it. Why not? 5 damage to your opponent's face or to whatever else you want to target. This is just awesome. There's also, Lightning Helix could target, Lightning Bolt. Doesn't really matter. Whatever it is, it's a free spell you're getting, and that's exactly what you want to be doing in Magic, right? Free stuff. So Vadrok, Apex of Thunder, really cool card, really complements the deck really well. You could also Cascade into it. We'll see that in a few minutes. But yeah, had a lot of fun with Vadrok. Now, Territorial Kavu. This card is a beast, alright? It's a 5/5 most of the time. By turn 3 the latest, it's a 5/5 creature, and whenever it attacks, you're doing some relevant stuff. So you can discard a card. If you do, you draw a card. So this is great, if you go mid to late game, you start overdrawing on lands. This is a great way to get rid of cards early on. Or, you're in game 2 and game 3, you draw some sideboard cards you realize you don't need. Or any other scenario, really. If you have a card that you don't want, boom, discard it. And if you do, draw a card. Worst case, if you don't want to do that, you can exile a card from a graveyard. That's always useful, especially in today's meta. You could try and turn off Delirium if you really want. Yeah, it's just, this is a beast. It's a 5/5. Few creatures can face to it. And with Sign of Draco on the battlefield, it just gets even more annoying because it gets Trample, because it is also green. And it also gets First Strike because it is also red. So with Sign of Draco on the battlefield, Territorial Kavu is almost impossible to beat. So speaking of Sign of Draco, alright, so this is what you do, okay? Turn 1, Save Triome. Turn 2, Breeding Pool, boom. You get a turn 2 Sign of Draco. Or, turn 1, Ketria Triome. Turn 2, Godless Shrine, boom. You get a turn 2 Sign of Draco. Those 2 scenarios, those 2 land drops get you a Sign of Draco, turn 2. And again, a really hard creature to deal with. It's 12 CMC, so Fatal Push is not going to be able to touch it. It has 4 toughness, so Lightning Bolt alone won't be able to touch it. Early on, Unholy Heat, may not have Delirium active. It won't be able to touch it. So Sign of Draco has far less spells early game that can deal with it, which means by turn 3, you have a 4/4 flyer in the air, and it's also powering up your other creatures. So for every creature that has white, it also has Vigilance. For every creature that's blue, it has Hexproof. For every creature that's black, it has Lifelink. For every creature that's red, First Strike. And for every creature that's green, Trample. And of course, if you have a red-green creature, you get 2. If you have a red-blue-white creature, you get all 3. So on and so forth. So this card is an amazing print. I love Sign of Draco. It's a boss. There have been games where I've had 3 of them on the battlefield, and you just look at the CMC, you're like, how's that possible? Well, Domain is why it's possible. So just an awesome creature. Really pulls this deck together and makes it a menace. So yeah, and of course the other core card here, Tribal Flames. Let me tell you, your opponents never see it coming, even though you're playing a domain deck. And you know what? 5 damage is a lot. It's a lot. All right, and you're paying 2 mana, but believe me, this has helped me finish off games more than I can count. Tribal Flames is just brutal card, and totally required to make this deck work properly and consistently. This, plus the 4 lightning bolts you're playing, plus the 4 lightning helixes that you're playing, you have so much burn in the main deck here to be able to get rid of creatures if you really want to, or just hit your opponent's face. And Tribal Flames does a really good job of doing that. Alright, so the other creatures. So I'm choosing a different mix of creatures here. Probably not what you're expecting from a Domain Zoo list, but I found this list, or this creature suite, to do really well for me. Now, one thing, Ragavan, obviously, flavor of the month. It's going to be the flavor of a few months, honestly. Not really required for this deck. So in theory, you can remove Ragavan, add some other ideally 2 CMC creature if you could find one. If not, put a 3 CMC in there. It's okay. It'll work. But if you can, afford Ragavans, a playset works well here. Early game, you're gaining value. Late game, your opponents have other creatures they're going to have to worry about, so Ragavan will probably get in. Worst case, it's a lightning rod for removal, which is great because then all your other creatures are going to get through, and I'm perfectly fine with that. So Ragavan here, or Ragavan, however you want to pronounce it, doing a really decent job of putting pressure on your opponent. And this is what this deck is. It's an aggro deck. Pressure on your opponent. It's always pressure. You're not holding up cards, apart from Lightning Bolt and Lightning Helix and Tribal Flames, but those are all pressure cards at the end of the day. Pressure, close out the games. Mantis Rider. This card is a beast. Mantis Rider is rarely good, but when it is good, it's horribly devastating for your opponent. And this is a deck where Mantis Rider is just beating face. Because again, your opponent's worrying about Sign of Draco, your opponent's worrying about Territorial Kavu, there's Ragavan on the battlefield, now they have to deal with Mantis Rider, and if you have Sign of Draco on the battlefield, Mantis Rider is getting some much needed power-ups, including, I believe, Hexproof, which just makes this card, you just can't deal with it. Yeah, it gets Hexproof, so you just can't deal with it. It's exactly what you want to be doing. Super puts a lot of pressure on your opponent, helps close out games really quickly. So Mantis Rider, I love being able to play this card, and it works in this deck. Shardless Agent. Alright, well, Shardless Agent and Bloodbraid Elf, I suppose. Now, I suppose you could do without them, but I really think these Cascade creatures fit well into this deck. So, Shardless Agent, not too exciting. It is just a 2/2 for 3. But the ability to get a free Ragavan, or Ragavan, Territorial Kavu, that is useful. Or, being able to get into a Lightning Bolt, or Lightning Helix, or Tribal Flames. Those are all really good hits. I mean, I think Ragavan is your worst hit of all the cards that I'm playing in this deck. And that's not bad. So, Shardless Agent works really well here. And, it puts a lot of pressure. It's a 2-for-1. And I strongly suggest you at least give it a shot before you decide to remove it. Again, pressure. If you get 2 spells for the cost of 1, do it. You definitely want to do it in this deck, and it works really well. Bloodbraid Elf, same thing. It hits the rest of the cards, or the rest of the creatures, I should say, in your deck. So cascading into, a Shardless Agent is great because then you can get 3 spells. But if you're not, you're hitting Mantis Rider, and that's perfectly fine as well. You could potentially hit Vadrok, which is fine. The only card you're not going to hit is Sign of Draco, and I don't really think that's a problem. Bloodbraid Elf also has haste. It's a 3/2, so you get some power-ups if Sign of Draco is also on the battlefield. So yeah, I mean, again, Cascade creatures here. My goal of this list was just, again, to put as much pressure as possible, and this is how I wanted to do it. Alright, the removal. Well, we already know we're playing 4 Tribal Flames. We're also playing 4 Lightning Bolt and 4 Lightning Helix. Again, here, there's room for you to play around. If you don't want to go so heavy on removal, there's maybe some other cards you want to play, or maybe you want to play more creatures, you could. But I really like having 12 removal spells, essentially. First of all, again, pressure. This is what this deck is doing. And the ability to gain life from Lightning Helix is also helpful because you are playing a very painful and expensive mana base. So being able to gain some life does help you out in a lot of your matchups. So keep that in mind, which is why I wanted to play 4 Lightning Helix. Most lists are running 2. I prefer 4. Alright, the lands, the tricky stuff here. Luckily, they're mostly one-ofs, so it's not going to completely break your bank. Wooded Foothills, play 4 of them. Red-green is really your core colors of this deck. Windswept Heath, you're playing 4 of those. 3 Arid Mesas. Now you're playing 1 Save Triumph, 1 Ketria Triumph. You don't really need more than that. You're playing 2 Stomping Grounds, again, red-green, really being the core of this deck. And everything else is a one-off. So 1 Steam Vents, Hallowed Fountains, Hallowed Fountain, Breeding Pool, Blood Crypt, Godless Shrine, Temple Garden. These are the shocks that I feel work the best with this deck. I guess you could mix and match a few other shocks, but you're playing almost all of them here anyway. I think you're missing 2, so it's not really a big deal. We're missing 3, so yeah, I would go with this shock plan, I guess you could say. You definitely want Godless Shrine and Breeding Pool, that's for sure, to help you get those turn 2 Sign of Dracos as much as possible. Sideboard, okay, the sideboard is where you can kill me. I really didn't know what I wanted to do. This is a sideboard that worked for me. It's really up to you what you want to do. Since you're playing so many Cascade creatures, it's really tricky on what cards you want to play here. So Defense Grid is mostly coming in against your control matchups, which are really poor. I would say it's one of your weaker matchups, so Defense Grid comes in handy there and kind of slowing them down. Rest in Peace is also good for shutting off control matchups that are playing Snapcaster Mage or heavily reliant on the graveyard. Rest in Peace will come in against the Delirium decks, so really powerful card, and you wouldn't mind cascading into it. Cinder Vines is also another card where it would be bad if you were to cascade into Destructive Revelry, for example, or in a Braid, because you might want to keep that removal for some future time. So Cinder Vines is a nice alternative to that, because if you cascade into it, boom, that's fine. It goes onto the battlefield, and then you could actually use it whenever you actually need it. And it also has some play against combo decks like Storm, so there are some benefits there. You have Path to Exile as well, playing 4 of those if you need some extra removal, or if you need removal that is not damage based, Path to Exile is your go-to. Last but not least, Alpine Moon is, well, the card that you're going to play to shut down specific lands, because obviously you can't play Blood Moon. Last but not least, the matchups. Alright, Combo, not your best matchup, at least in the main, at least your main 60. You could, I suppose, in theory, race them if they are fumbling a bit, but realistically speaking, you don't really have much in your main to slow them down. Now, in your sideboard, you have a lot of tools at your disposal, and you're going to really rely on those tools, but combo is really not your thing. Now, if you're playing against primetime decks, you have a pretty good chance there, because unless they have the nuts, or they have 2 Amulet of Vigors or whatever, you can kind of deal with them. You can actually race them a bit and potentially close out the game before they can. And then in your sideboard, you have Alpine Moon and other cards at your disposal that can help you out. But for Storm decks, for example, or Living End decks, those are going to be a lot harder to deal with. So again, combo not going to be the main strong suit of this deck. You can sideboard differently. You could adjust your sideboard accordingly to kind of deal with those decks, but it's just something that I had to deal with and accept. Aggro decks now. Aggro decks are pretty good because they go wide, but so do you, and oftentimes your creatures are a lot bigger. You're also packing a lot of removals, so against the aggro matchups, depending on how things are going, your removal can be aimed at their creatures as opposed to your opponent's face, which is just as devastating, because if you're going to be clearing the way for your Territorial Kavu, for example, well then, boom, it's going to close out the games perfectly quick for you anyway. You have quite a bit of flyers in your deck as well, and a lot of the current aggro decks don't have too many flyers apart from Murktide region, and I mean, you're not really worried about Delver of Secrets, or Flip Delver of Secrets, I should say. So again, your aggro matchups are actually pretty good, and worst case scenario, if you feel like you're feeling a bit underwhelmed, or if you want to deal with Murktide Regent, bring your Path to Exiles in, and you could deal with your Murktides that way, or just make it impossible for them to fill their graveyard by playing Rest in Peace, or do all of it. It's really up to you. Control is the other matchup where, again, it's going to be difficult here. You're really going to have to play the longer game, which is what Control's already kind of has to do. Keep in mind, the odds are they're going to be they're going to have an answer for everything, so try and bait them as much as possible. Maybe you want to play Cavern of Souls, but realistically, how many caverns can you play? If you're only playing one, it's not enough. So this is a tough call to what you can really do here. Your sideboard can help you a bit depending on the type of control deck you're playing. Maybe bringing an Alpine Moon to shut off a certain color, but that's kind of a long shot. So again, control matchups, not your best, but you're not seeing too much full-on control right now, at least in the higher tiers, so I think you're going to be fine. Mid-range. Again, I'm not too worried about mid-range here. You have a lot of creatures, so if they discard or remove the first few, not a big deal. Your creatures are also relatively big. Fatal Push, Lightning Bolt, they're all going to have issues with some of your creatures. Well, I should say Son of Draco is relatively big for Fatal Push, but Lightning Bolt is going to have an issue hitting Territorial Kavu, for example, so on and so forth. So mid-range matchups, you're going to have to grind a bit. You're probably going to have to bring in some artifact removal for Stoneblade decks, but generally speaking, you do actually pretty well against mid-range. Again, pressure, pressure, pressure. Make sure you're staying ahead of them. Make sure they're dealing with answering you as opposed to playing their game plan, and you're good to go. Tron, here again, if Tron has a slow rollout, if they don't have a turn, even a turn 3 Karn might not be enough. You can deal a ton of damage to them early game, and you also have a lot of removal. You have a lot of bolts here. You have a lot of lightning bolts, lightning helixes, tribal flames. Those all get around cards like Ensnaring Bridge, which is again the worst card ever printed. So if you're getting Ensnaring Bridge to game 1 because they went and they got it from their sideboard, thanks to Karn, the great creator, well, you could also just start hitting their face with lightning bolts and lightning helixes and making sure you take out their planeswalkers where possible. And again, in your sideboard, you have Alpine Moon, so on and so forth, so you can deal with those cards a bit better game 2 and game 3. So I'm not too worried about Tron. Borderline Magic, well, again, this is kind of like a dice throw here. It really depends on what you're playing. What's nice is that you can play Rest in Peace really comfortably. So if you're playing against Dredge, this is a nice way to do it. If you're playing against, mill decks, this is actually, Rest in Peace is not bad against mill decks because some of their draw engines require a certain amount of cards in the graveyard. So if all your cards are getting exiled, well, then they don't have access they don't have that much easy access to those draw engines. So that might be a double-edged sword there you might want to think about. But again, it really depends on what you're seeing. If you're seeing a lot of degenerate decks in your meta, sideboard accordingly. But generally speaking, let me just finish off on this. This deck was a ton of fun to play. I'm telling you. Maybe it's just me because I don't often play full-on aggro decks, but this was just really satisfying. The deck pulled its weight really well, rarely lost. I almost wanted to just stop doing everything and go into a league because I was just so happy with how well this deck was doing. So I have about 5 matches going up today. Stay tuned for those. That's it for this deck tech. I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Enjoy my content in general, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, follow me on Twitter, Facebook, share my content on social media, watch it start to finish like you're doing right now. All that stuff really helps out a lot. I really do appreciate it. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, check out my Patreon link in the description of this video if you want to support me on Patreon. Check out the Patreon Rewards program. Listen, I'll sell it really short and quick here, but there's a video on my Patreon page that explains it all. My Patreon Rewards program. You put in your $5 or whatever every month for your patronage. At the end of every year, you get a rare or mythic for every month you've been a patron, up to 24 months, or up to 24 rares and mythics. So if you're a patron for 2, 3, 4 years, whatever, you get 24 rares and mythics. And at the end of every year, each rare mythic is valued between $3 and $15. Even if you average it out like $5, you're at least getting your money back. Odds are you're getting a bit more. Simple as that. Your money is here for my sealed product openings to fund that. All the rares and mythics, I give away anyway. So a portion of those rares and mythics are just going to go back to you. Check it out. Really, really appreciate it. Thanks, and have a good one.